Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever noticed that literally every company out there actually has two cultures? I mean, there's the one printed on those glossy posters in the lobby, right? The stated culture, packed with all the right buzzwords and grand ideals. But then there's the real one. And that real culture, it lives in the unspoken beliefs. It's the stories circulating around the water cooler, the hushed phrases people repeat in the corridors about how things actually work around here. And here's the thing. When those two cultures diverge, that's when dissonance and dysfunction totally take over. So today, we're going to dive into how to spot and actually rewrite those hidden messages that are quietly sabotaging your team's performance.
And to kick things off, consider this incredibly powerful idea from Simon Sinek. He says, culture is not what you claim to believe, it is what you tolerate. Wow. Think about that. The real culture of your organization doesn't live in some beautifully bound handbook they hand to new hires on day one. No, it is shaped entirely by what leadership and peers just tolerate on a daily basis. It solidifies around these habits and messages that no one actually sat down and consciously chose, but everyone just keeps reproducing over and over again, almost on autopilot. It's really the daily friction of what is actually allowed to happen.
Now, researchers Jay Schwartz and Jay Thompson, they actually have a name for these hidden culprits. They call them deceptive organizational messages. And these messages, they usually spring up from some past experience, they kind of crystallize into a habit, and then they're just never questioned again, ever. They act like this invisible filter, right? Selectively directing people's attention so you only notice evidence that confirms the story, while completely, and I mean entirely, ignoring any evidence that disproves it. And honestly, the scariest part about all of this, they operate completely unconsciously. So let's break down the 4 specific ways these messages can totally fracture a workplace.
Okay, first up, we have a distorted perception of risk. This really shows how an organization's relationship with risk can spawn 2 completely opposite but equally damaging dysfunctions. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got an excess of confidence. It's this kind of arrogance where the underlying message is basically, hey, we are different. The normal rules of the market, yeah, they just don't apply to us. But then on the flip side of that, you have an excess of caution, which results in absolute paralysis. The message there is, we absolutely cannot proceed without every single person's agreement. And let's be real, both of these are incredibly toxic beliefs that just disguise themselves as valuable experience.
Which brings us to category 2, distorted perceptions of value. Look, how we perceive the value of our work completely dictates our culture. And again, we see 2 totally extreme ends here. First is this crushing, all-or-nothing perfectionism, driven by the message, we do not present this until it is 100% ready, right? Sound familiar? Well, the polar opposite is minimum effort, where the driving narrative is literally just about ticking the box. People say, that's fine. There's no need to do any more. Have you ever heard someone drop the classic line, we're not that kind of organization? That is a textbook toxic message used to instantly shut down any conversation about value or innovation before it even gets off the ground.
All right, moving on to the trap of distorted competence. And man, this one absolutely destroys authentic communication. Have you ever been on a team suffering from low collective self-efficacy? That's the situation where people endlessly repeat things like, we're just not effective, we never have been, and honestly, we never will be. It's so deflating. Conversely, though, you have presumptive overconfidence. This happens when someone just assumes, well, everyone wants this exact thing as much as I do. It's obvious. In both of these totally distorted environments, the real tragedy is that nobody even feels the need to actually ask questions or communicate with each other, because in their minds, the story has already decided the outcome.
Finally, we have distorted validity. Basically, this is how a company decides what is actually true. Often, we see this play out as emotional reasoning totally pitted against rigid rationalism. With emotional reasoning, the logic is simply, well, we feel good about this, so there won't be any problems, right? Just trusting the gut. But pitted directly against that is rigid rationalism, where someone says, we presented the data. Anyone who disagrees is simply wrong. Now, believe it or not, this rigid rationalism is actually at the very heart of so many failed organizational changes. Leaders just expect people to fall in line with the cold logic, and then they are genuinely shocked when they face massive resistance.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the dysfunctions, but how do we actually go about fixing them? Well, the researchers give us a really straightforward 3-step method to dismantle and transform these deceptive messages. Step 1 is renaming. You literally have to call it out, explicitly state that the story circulating is just a message, it is not absolute reality. Step 2 is reframing, which basically means you have to build the new story. Because remember, you can't just kill an old story. Nature abhors a vacuum. If you don't actively build a new narrative, a different distorted one is just going to take its place. And step 3 is refocusing. This means taking that new narrative and repeating it in every single meeting, every decision until it literally becomes the new culture.
Let's actually look at step 2, reframing, in practice.
A leader's primary task right here is to provide a credible alternative. Say the misleading story is a closed message, like, "Things never change here." We all know that instantly kills any fresh energy. But you can't just walk in and say, "You're wrong." Instead, you reframe it into an open message. You say, "Change is difficult, and it takes time, but here is where we have already changed, and here is exactly where we want to get to." See what happened there? You take a message that completely shuts down possibilities, and you transform it into one that actually opens them up.
But here is the catch, and it's a big one. Literally, none of this works without what researcher Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety. These misleading messages, they persist precisely because people are just absolutely terrified to challenge the dominant narratives. Now, here's the absolute crucial distinction. Psychological safety is not about avoiding conflict. Actually, it's the exact opposite. It is the condition that makes conflict productive. It gives your team the runway to raise issues, to openly dissent without any fear of retaliation, and to ask those awkward, difficult questions necessary to dismantle those toxic messages. Because without psychological safety, the real culture remains completely untouchable.
Now, to truly embed this cultural shift, the science of happiness points us to two absolutely vital pillars. First up is what they call plus US, which is collective cohesion. Look, culture isn't an individual sport, it's heavily relational. A highly cohesive team will naturally correct one another and resist those deceptive messages as a unified front. The second pillar is plus discipline. Listen, consistency is literally the only communication that actually matters. It is the daily discipline of leadership acting consistently with the new story, especially when it's hard. Because at the end of the day, every single behavior you tolerate is sending a message to your team.
Which brings us right to the ultimate question. The one you have to ask yourself if you want to reshape your real culture. What kind of company do we want to become, and what will it take to actually do that? By challenging those hidden messages and actively fostering psychological safety, you can finally align your stated culture with your real, everyday culture. Because remember, culture isn't what you write down in your core values deck. It's what you whisper in the corridors. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Now go out there and keep questioning the narrative.